Hello everyone, welcome to my podcast, Thinking Sovereignty. Today I'm going to talk about decolonisation and how that Aboriginal people can take control of the decolonisation process. Now what I suggest is that a decolonisation council could be set up. This would be similar to what the Referendum Council did for the Uluru Statement of the Heart. So these are the things that the committee could keep in mind. Now the Uluru Statement from the Heart, the Referendum Council that led to that, actually gives a pretty good example of what needs to happen. There needs to be a national consensus, a consensus that represents peoples from all over the territory that's going to be decolonised. So you would want representation from stolen generations, from people who've descended from the missions, as well as people who are LORE law holders, traditional law holders and traditional owners. The mandate needs to represent a spectrum. Now this is because under General Assembly Resolution 1514, it is the peoples of the colonised territory, the pre-colonial communities, that are the peoples who need to exercise this right. So that is all communities which have a historical continuity with pre-colonial communities. Now note that this also includes stolen generations and people who have lost their law. The right to decolonise is not dependent on holding a connection with the land and a connection with the law. The people who have the mandate to decolonise are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as per the three-part definition. And in fact, that's where the three-part definition comes from. The three-part definition of Aboriginality, that is descent, self-identification and community identification, that's actually derived indirectly from these decolonisation resolutions. This three-part definition was solidified during the 90s, and this happened in the lead-up to the 1999 referendum. Now this three-part definition was tied to ATSIC election criteria. So to run as a candidate for ATSIC elections, you had to meet this three-part criteria. Now the reason for this is that ATSIC was set up in the late 1980s in preparation for the 1999 referendum. If Australia attempts to become a republic without the mandate of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it will be a fragile republic. It could be overturned at any time by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples if they figure out what they can do. So the best way to fight against the Uluru Statement from the Heart is, in fact, to put forward an alternative proposal for decolonisation. That's what the Uluru Statement from the Heart really is. It is a decolonisation proposal, but it is an absolutely rotten one because it won't give land rights, it won't give reparations, it won't even give any internationally protected power for Aboriginal people. All it will give is a protected so-called voice to Parliament. Now note that a voice to Parliament is voting rights. That's what it boils down to, because at the moment Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples don't have voting rights because they are not a part of the Australian polity. Aboriginal people can vote at the discretion of the states. The states can deny Aboriginal people the vote based on race at any time they like. Of course they're not going to do that because then the game's up if they do that, but that's how it is. And in the past, the states have denied people the voting rights. So there's never been a promise or a contract made that binds the states and Aboriginal people so that Aboriginal people have the vote. So when you ask for a guaranteed voice to Parliament, you may just be asking for a guaranteed vote or voting rights, in other words. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a separate, dedicated Indigenous or Aboriginal only body that is voted exclusively by Aboriginal people and has Aboriginal people sitting on it. If you notice carefully the language that's used, it doesn't say this. They say the voice to Parliament is an Indigenous voice to Parliament. It is not an Indigenous only voice to Parliament. And I think ultimately the Indigenous voice to Parliament will be kind of like integrated with the Australian polity. So it will be, in the end of the day, it will mean voting rights. So you have to be very careful. Like the Uluru Statement is a really rotten deal. It would not meet Aboriginal expectations. I believe that the Tent Embassy could play a really strong and important role in a decolonisation process, in a real Aboriginal-led decolonisation process. To me, the embassy sits out in front of the Parliament House, and I've always seen it as an invitation for the colonial system to come out of the house and to sit with us and to deal with this unsolved business under our terms. I made a meme last year and it said, "We don't want to sit at your table, we want you to sit under our tree." And to me, that's the way it should be, because it's our land. It is up to the settler state to come and sit under our tree. We don't necessarily want a seat at your table. It is our land. You come to us. That's kind of my thinking of the Tent Embassy and what it stands for to me. Of course, other people got other ideas about what it stands for. But yeah, that's just my idea. Now, I think there's a potential here because that embassy's been sitting there for 50 years now. The decolonisation resolutions in 1960, they are now 61 years ago. So the Australian settler state has been on notice for 61 years from the wider international community. And the international community in 1960 called for a speedy end to colonialism in all of its forms and manifestations. Now, 61 years is not speedy. I think it's time to really put some pressure on them. The way that pressure can be placed is to get organised. And my idea is to form a decolonisation council. Now, it's very important that this council has a limited mandate and it has some restrictions placed on it, because such a committee, if it really does manage to get the backing of a good chunk of the Aboriginal people, it will have absolutely huge power. And so the last thing we want is for people who are power hungry and pushing their own agenda to come in and take that over, because there's a big potential for that. This council may have the power to set the territorial status of the entire continent. So that's a massive responsibility and massive power. So what I would suggest is that from the start, the committee cannot do the following without first going to the people. It cannot declare independence. It cannot make any agreements with any tier of Australian government. It cannot do any treaty with any non-Aboriginal nation. Now it can do those things, but first they have to go to the people and they have to meet a certain acceptance, a certain level of acceptance in the wider Aboriginal community. So say, like in Australia, to change the constitution, you need majority of the people in the majority of the states. Now, that's the same kind of thing that this council would need in order to do one of those things that I've just said, like declare independence. You need to get a decent majority of Aboriginal people before you can go and do things like that, before you can go sign treaties, enter into agreements with the Australian governments, or declare independence. Now, what we also need is a education campaign so that people can come to a decision. Colonialism has left our people in a real mess, but I don't think it's really that messy as it looks. I think we really keep our law. We know who our mob is, for example. We know who we are, and that will be a really fantastic basis to work from. And that's all about declaring political status. We know who we are. We know where we belong. I know some people are disconnected, but we can bring them in as well, and we have to think about how to do that as well. Now, one other thing that's really important in this process is to draw a line in the sand about who is in this community, who is a part of the pre-colonial community, this pan-Aboriginal Islander community, and who is not. For example, Bruce Pascoe or Mark McMurtry, for example. I don't know if these men actually have Aboriginal blood. They claim to be Aboriginal. Do they have blood or not? We need to find a way as a community to say yes or no. Is this person a part of our community or not? That's going to be maybe a hard thing to do. There's going to be some hard decisions to make there. Do you accept people without a bloodline? I think generally we don't, but maybe there are some exceptions out there. These are important decisions to make, because when it comes to the time where we have to make a decision, we have to know, who has voting rights, or who has a say in this, because we need to work as a collective. Now, strictly speaking, under international law, traditional law holders, people who have that connection to the land, the people who hold the stories, they are not the ones that have the say over how decolonisation happens. It is actually the entire community with the shared experience of colonialism, even those who don't have language, who don't have law. But those people, that pan-Aboriginal community as a whole, can choose to use the law and to use law holders as their basis for their self-identification and for their own system of governance. Now, I suggest that that's a good idea to do, that we as a community, including those who are maybe stolen, that we ground ourselves in that traditional law. Because our traditional law has served us very well through colonialism. Even in terms of just identification, it's kept us together. I think it's a bad idea to abandon it, because when we abandon the law, we will open ourselves to be torn to pieces by the colony. It will be divide and conquer open season if we abandon our law. Colonialism has brought a lot of challenges, and I think our law is very good at addressing a lot of those challenges, but at the same time the law needs to adapt. So yeah, that's my thoughts on a Aboriginal Decolonisation Committee. So I guess the main points are that the community needs to be educated, I suppose, needs to know more about decolonisation in terms of Resolution 1541 from the United Nations. People need to know what their options are, that they have the right to independence, that they have the right to secession, to leave Australia if they want. They have the right to a treaty, and they have the right to also become just Australian citizens like everyone else. And it is the choice of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples as a whole community. There are a number of other things to be aware in the decolonisation process, such as the principle of uti possidetis juris. And what uti possidetis juris means is that all of Australia territory has to decolonise in one go. It's a bit like pulling off a band-aid. You can't just pull off a small part of the band-aid, you have to rip the whole thing off in one go. Now, this is why I don't think the Murray Republic Declaration of Independence will work, because they actually need the consent of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as a whole for them to become independent. Now, I know this rule sounds a bit dumb, but it's established international precedence. It's already established, and it's something that you have to work with. There's probably a whole heap of other little gotchas like that we just don't know about, because, well, a lot of this information has been kept from us. Nobody's ever sat down and given Aboriginal people all their options and actually shown how it can be done. Now, let's say, for example, this committee goes out and all the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples come together and they come up with a proposal that they're all happy with. And then they go to approach Australia, and Australia says no. Where can they go? Well, this is where you go back to those United Nations Decolonisation resolutions. The resolutions actually call for joint and separate action. Now, separate action means that every state signatory to the UN Charter has an obligation to assist us. So we could go talk to the United Nations, to the C24 Committee, or one of these Indigenous rights committees, something like that. They're probably not going to help though, because they have been corrupted. But there is another option, because the resolutions themselves call for an end to colonisation through both joint and separate action. So joint action would mean like United Nations bureaucracy help, but there's also separate action. Now there are 193 or something nation-state members of the United Nations. Now every single one of those, when they signed up to the UN Charter, they agreed to this. They agreed to assist those who are struggling for self-determination, and particularly in colonial situations. So out of those 193 member states, there's only a handful that still have a vested interest in settler colonialism. So what we can do when we've got our mandate and when we've got the backing of the people, we can start approaching individual nation states and ask for their help. It may only take a few of them. Now, just demonstrating that we are capable of diplomatically engaging with other nation states I think that will probably put enough pressure on Australia and force them to come to the table on whatever proposal we've come up with. It will put absolutely massive pressure on Australia to do the right thing, especially since they have failed for 61 years and counting, when the decolonisation resolutions actually call for a speedy end to colonialism. So going to work to try to find a common ground between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples about how they want to decolonise, it is worth it.